The letter arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the windows of Blackthorn Manor, each crystalline pattern a reminder that winter refused to release its grip on the countryside. Alistair Blackthorn stood in his study, turning the envelope over in his hands, noting the wax seal that bore a crest he recognized instantly, the intertwined oak and raven of House Hartfell. His breath caught in his throat, not from the cold that seeped through the stone walls, but from the impossible reality of what he held. The seal was genuine, the handwriting unmistakable, yet the man who had penned this letter had been dead for 3 months. Garrett Hartfell had been more than a friend to Alistair. They had grown up together, 2 boys from different stations who found kinship in their shared love of horses, adventure, and the kind of loyalty that transcends social boundaries. While Alistair had been groomed from birth to inherit a dukedom burdened by both wealth and expectation, Garrett had possessed something Alistair always envied, a lightness of spirit, an ability to find joy in simple moments. When Garrett had written to announce his engagement 5 years ago, Alistair had travelled through a snowstorm to attend the wedding, standing as witness to vows spoken in a small chapel surrounded by wildflowers that Garrett's bride had picked herself that morning. He had met Elowen only once before that wedding, briefly, at a country dance where she had worn a dress the colour of summer wheat and laughed at something Garrett whispered in her ear. Alistair remembered thinking they seemed perfectly matched, Garrett with his easy charm and Elowen with her quiet grace, like 2 halves of a whole that had finally found each other. The wedding itself had been intimate, almost secretive, which Alistair had attributed to Garrett's preference for privacy rather than spectacle. There had been no grand announcements, no society pages documenting the union, just 2 people in love and a handful of witnesses who understood that sometimes the most profound moments require no audience beyond those who truly matter. After the wedding, Alistair had returned to his duties as Duke, managing estates that sprawled across 3 counties, navigating political alliances that required constant attention, and shouldering responsibilities that left little room for personal indulgence. He and Garrett had corresponded regularly, letters filled with updates on harvests and horses, questions about estate management, and occasional philosophical musings about duty versus desire. Garrett had mentioned his happiness often, describing a life at Ravenshade that seemed idyllic, morning rides through forests thick with ancient oaks, evenings by the fire with Elowen reading aloud from novels while he sketched plans for expanding the orchards, a simple contentment that Alistair found himself envying more with each passing year. Then the letters had stopped. The news of Garrett's death had reached Alistair through official channels rather than personal ones, a formal notice delivered by a lawyer who explained that there had been an accident, that Garrett had been found at the base of the cliffs near Ravenshade, that the local magistrate had ruled it a tragic fall during a morning ride. Alistair had attended the funeral in a daze, standing in the rain as they lowered his friend into the ground, watching Elowen from a distance as she stood perfectly still, her face obscured by a black veil, accepting condolences with mechanical precision. He had approached her only briefly, offering words that felt inadequate even as he spoke them, and she had merely nodded, her eyes unfocused, as though she were looking through him rather than at him. Now holding this letter that had apparently been written before Garrett's death, but delivered according to instructions Alistair could only guess at, he felt the weight of the past 3 months pressing down on him. He broke the seal carefully, unfolding the pages with hands that trembled slightly, and began to read. Garrett's handwriting was as familiar as his own, each loop and stroke carrying memories of shared letters and notes passed during tedious social functions. But the words themselves carried a weight Alistair had never encountered in their correspondence before. Garrett wrote of premonitions and fears, of threats he had been unable to fully identify but had felt closing in around him. He mentioned debts that were not his own but had somehow become his responsibility, enemies who remained nameless but whose presence he sensed in every shadow. Most troubling was Garrett's assertion that if Alistair was reading this letter, then something had happened to him, something that was not merely an accident despite how it might appear. The letter contained specific instructions regarding Ravenshade, financial arrangements that needed attention, legal documents that required signatures. But woven through these practical matters was a thread of desperation that made Alistair's chest tighten. Garrett wrote about Eowyn with a devotion that bordered on reverence, describing her strength and intelligence, her stubborn independence, and the wound she carried from a past Garrett himself admitted he had never fully understood. He wrote about secrets she kept locked away, about nightmares that woke her gasping in the darkness, about a resilience that both amazed and worried him. The final paragraph was what had stolen Alistair's breath entirely. Garrett asked, no, pleaded for Alistair to watch over Eowyn if anything happened to him, not merely to manage the estate or ensure her financial security, but to protect her with the full weight of his position and power, to trust her judgment even when it seemed questionable, to believe her even when others might doubt, and above all, to prevent her from making decisions driven by guilt or grief rather than genuine desire. Garrett wrote that he feared what Eowyn might do to herself if left entirely alone, that beneath her composed exterior lay a darkness she had spent years holding at bay, and that without someone she could trust completely, that darkness might finally consume her. Alistair read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing layers he had missed before. Between the lines, he sensed things Garrett had wanted to say but couldn't put into words, warnings about dangers that were too nebulous to name, fears about enemies who remained hidden, and a love so profound that even death could not diminish its force. The letter ended with a single line that would haunt Alistair for the rest of his life. I am trusting you with the only thing in this world that truly matters to me. Do not let her fall into the darkness alone. 2 days later, Alistair's carriage rolled through the gates of Ravenshade, and he saw for the first time the estate that had been Garrett's sanctuary and final resting place. The house itself was a sprawling manor built of grey stone that seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light rather than reflect it. Extensive gardens, now showing signs of neglect, stretched in all directions, their carefully planned chaos of roses and lavender slowly succumbing to winter's advance. Beyond the gardens, forests pressed close, ancient oaks and ash trees creating a boundary that felt more like a barrier than a border, as though Ravenshade existed in a pocket of space separate from the rest of the world. The housekeeper who admitted him was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she missed nothing. She introduced herself as Mrs. Brennan and explained that Lady Hartfell was not currently receiving visitors. Alistair produced Garrett's letter, along with the legal documents that established his authority as executor of the estate, and watched Mrs. Brennan's expression shift from suspicious to resigned. She led him through hallways lined with portraits of Hartfell ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow his progress, until they reached a set of double doors that opened into a library. Eowyn Hartfell stood with her back to the door, staring out a window that overlooked the gardens. She wore a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back severely, and when she turned to face him, Alistair was struck by how different she appeared from the woman he remembered from the wedding. That woman had possessed a vibrancy that lit her from within, a warmth that drew people to her like moths to flame. The woman before him now seemed carved from ice, her beauty still evident but frozen, as though some essential part of her had been locked away where warmth could never reach it again. Her eyes met his with a directness that was almost challenging. They were grey, he noticed, like storm clouds before rain, and they held an intelligence that seemed to catalogue everything about him in an instant. She did not offer her hand or make any gesture of welcome. Instead, she simply waited, standing perfectly still in a way that suggested she could remain there indefinitely until he explained himself or left, whichever came first. Alistair found himself struggling for words, which was unusual for a man trained from childhood in the art of diplomacy and negotiation. He had prepared a speech during the journey, carefully crafted phrases meant to convey respect and sympathy while establishing his authority to fulfill Garrett's requests. But standing before this woman whose grief seemed to create a force field around her, all his practiced words evaporated, leaving him with only raw honesty. He told her about the letter, about Garrett's concerns and his final wishes, about the arrangements that needed to be made for the estate and the protections Garrett had wanted in place. As he spoke, he watched her face for any reaction, but she remained as still as a statue, her expression revealing nothing. When he finished, silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally she spoke. Her voice was low, almost musical, but carried an edge that suggested she had grown accustomed to defending herself against unwanted intrusions. She thanked him for coming, acknowledged that Garrett must have had his reasons for making such requests, but made clear that she required no protection or oversight. The estate was hers by right of marriage, the finances were already arranged through Garrett's lawyers, and she preferred to grieve in solitude rather than become anyone's burden or responsibility. Her words were polite but firm, each sentence a small wall being erected between them, until Alistair understood that she fully intended to dismiss him and resume her self-imposed isolation. He could have left. There was nothing legally binding him to stay, no obligation that superseded her explicit wishes. But as he looked at her standing there so rigidly controlled, so determinedly alone, he saw what Garrett must have seen, the cracks in the facade, the tremor in her hands she thought she concealed, the exhaustion that lurked behind her composed expression. This was not a woman who was managing her grief well. This was a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will, and Garrett had known that will would eventually fail if she had no one to catch her when it did. So Alistair did something that surprised them both. He told her the truth without pretense or diplomacy. He explained that he had known Garrett since they were children, that his friend's death had left a void in his own life he was still learning to navigate, and that honoring Garrett's final wishes was not about obligation, but about love. He admitted that he did not know what threats Garrett had feared, or what secrets haunted Ravenshade, but that discovering the truth seemed like the least he could do for a friend who had deserved so much more than whatever fate had actually befallen him. And he made clear that he was not offering to manage her or control her, but simply to be present, to help carry burdens that had become too heavy for one person alone. For the first time since he had entered the library, something shifted in Elowen's expression. It was not acceptance or gratitude, but rather a flicker of surprise, as though she had not expected honesty from a duke she barely knew. She studied him with those storm-grey eyes, and Alistair had the distinct impression that she was weighing something carefully, deciding whether to trust even a fraction of what he had said. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. She agreed to let him stay for a few days, to review Garrett's papers and understand the estate's circumstances, but she made clear that this did not constitute acceptance of his ongoing involvement, merely acknowledgement that some matters required attention. Alistair accepted these terms, understanding that for someone as clearly guarded as Elowen, even this small concession represented a significant compromise. Mrs. Brennan showed him to a guest room in the east wing, apologizing for the chill and explaining that much of the house had been shut down since the funeral to conserve resources. Alistair assured her the accommodations were fine, more than adequate, and spent the remainder of the afternoon unpacking and arranging his belongings while wondering what exactly he had committed himself to by staying. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. Elowen joined him in a dining room that felt cavernous, with only 2 people present, the long table emphasizing the distance between them. She ate very little, pushing food around her plate while answering his attempts at conversation with brief, polite responses that discouraged further inquiry. He learned that she had lived at Ravenshade for all 5 years of her marriage, that she had no family to speak of except a distant cousin she had not seen in years, and that she preferred her own company to social obligations, which was why they had rarely entertained guests during Garrett's lifetime. What she did not say was equally revealing. She never mentioned the circumstances of Garrett's death, beyond confirming the official account of an accident during a morning ride. She did not speak of their marriage in terms that suggested intimacy or partnership, but rather used language that implied companionship and mutual respect. And when Alistair mentioned the debts and threats Garrett had alluded to in his letter, she tensed visibly, before insisting she knew nothing about such matters, that Garrett must have been mistaken or exaggerating concerns that had no basis in reality. Alistair did not press, understanding that trust had to be earned rather than demanded. Instead, he asked permission to review Garrett's study the following morning, to examine the estate records and financial documents as executor. Elowen agreed with clear reluctance, making him promise not to disturb anything unnecessarily, and excused herself immediately after the meal, claiming exhaustion. Left alone in the dining room with only candles for company, Alistair reflected on the strangeness of the situation. He had expected to find a grieving widow in need of assistance, someone who would welcome support during a difficult transition. Instead, he had found a woman who seemed determined to shoulder everything alone, who viewed his presence not as help, but as an intrusion she was forced to tolerate. Yet beneath her resistance, he sensed something else, a fear she was trying desperately to hide, a vulnerability she refused to acknowledge. That night Alistair lay awake in his borrowed bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Ravenshade settling around him. The house creaked and groaned like a ship at sea, timbers adjusting to temperature changes, wind finding gaps in the old stone walls. But beneath these normal sounds, he thought he heard something else, soft footsteps in the corridor outside his room, pausing briefly before his door and then moving on. He rose and opened the door quickly, catching a glimpse of a figure in white disappearing around a corner at the far end of the hall. He followed, driven by curiosity and concern, moving quietly through the darkened house. The figure led him downstairs and through passages until he found himself in a wing of the manor he had not yet explored. Here, the air felt colder, damper, as though this part of the house was not regularly inhabited. He lost sight of the figure but continued forward until he reached a door that stood slightly ajar, lamplight spilling through the gap. Peering inside, he saw Elowen standing in what appeared to be Garrett's study, though clearly it had been left untouched since his death. Papers still lay scattered across the desk, books remained open to pages Garrett had been reading, even a riding coat hung on a hook as though waiting for its owner to return. Elowen stood in the center of this preserved space, her nightgown and robe making her look almost ghostly in the lamplight, and she was speaking in a low voice to the empty room. Alistair could not make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. She was arguing with someone who was not there, her voice rising and falling with emotion she had carefully suppressed during their dinner conversation. He watched as she picked up papers from the desk, examined them with trembling hands, then set them down again as though burned. She moved through the room, touching things carefully, reverentially, until finally she sank into Garrett's chair and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs she had clearly been holding back for far too long. Alistair retreated quietly, unwilling to intrude on such a private moment of grief. He returned to his room feeling like a voyeur who had witnessed something deeply personal without permission. But he also felt confirmed in his instinct that Elowen was barely holding herself together, that beneath her composed exterior lay an anguish she had no safe outlet for expressing. Garrett had been right to worry about what she might do if left entirely alone with her grief and whatever other burdens she carried. The following morning brought revelations that only deepened the mystery. Alistair spent hours in Garrett's study with Elowen's reluctant permission, sorting through papers that painted a picture far more complicated than he had anticipated. The estate finances were indeed in order, as Elowen had claimed, but buried among routine accounts and correspondence were documents that suggested Garrett had been investigating something in the months before his death. There were letters from London that referenced meetings Garrett had requested with various officials, inquiries about property records and legal precedents, questions about inheritance laws and trusts. There were also notes in Garrett's handwriting that seemed to catalogue observations about people. Names Alistair did not recognize, descriptions of behaviors that seemed suspicious, dates and times that meant nothing without context. Most troubling were the references to something Garrett called the original sin, which appeared repeatedly in his notes without ever being explicitly defined. Alistair was puzzling over these cryptic entries when Elowen appeared in the doorway, startling him from his concentration. She had clearly been crying despite the early hour, her eyes red-rimmed, though she had made efforts to conceal the evidence. She asked what he had found, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer would not be simple or comforting. When he explained what he had been reading, she grew very still, that familiar tension returning to her posture. She told him then, with obvious reluctance, that Garrett had become obsessed with something in his final months. He had travelled to London repeatedly, meeting with lawyers and researchers, asking questions about her family history and the circumstances of her parents' deaths when she was a child. She had not understood his fixation, had asked him repeatedly to explain what he was searching for, but he had insisted he needed to be certain of facts before sharing theories that might prove groundless. He had promised to tell her everything once he had answers, but death had claimed him before he could fulfill that promise. Alistair listened carefully, noting not just what she said, but what she omitted. She did not explain why Garrett would have been investigating her past, did not speculate about what original sin might refer to, and became evasive when Alistair asked direct questions about her childhood and family. It was clear she was keeping secrets, but whether to protect herself or protect him from knowledge she considered dangerous, he could not determine. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Brennan announcing a visitor, a man who identified himself as Mr. Nathaniel Crowe, a lawyer from London. Elowen's reaction to this name was immediate and visceral. She went pale, her hands clenching into fists, and for a moment Alistair thought she might actually refuse to receive the visitor. But she composed herself with visible effort and agreed to meet with Crowe in the drawing room, requesting that Alistair be present as executor of Garrett's estate. Nathaniel Crowe was a man in his 50s, with the kind of face that revealed nothing. Smooth, pleasant, utterly forgettable except for eyes that missed no detail. He expressed condolences for Garrett's death with practiced sympathy, then got directly to the point of his visit. He represented certain parties who had business dealings with Elowen's late father, debts that remained unpaid despite the passage of years. These debts, he explained, had technically passed to Elowen as her father's only heir, though they had chosen not to pursue collection while she was under the protection of her marriage. However, now that she was widowed, these obligations could no longer be ignored. The sum he mentioned was staggering, enough to consume Ravenshade entirely and leave Elowen destitute. Alistair immediately challenged the claim, demanding to see documentation and legal justification for debts that had supposedly gone uncollected for over 20 years. Crowe produced papers that appeared legitimate on the surface, though Alistair noted they bore signatures and seals he would need to verify independently. The lawyer insisted the debts were genuine and enforceable, that his clients had been patient out of respect for Elowen's changed circumstances, but could wait no longer. Throughout this exchange, Elowen sat frozen, her face a mask that revealed nothing, but Alistair saw her hands trembling in her lap, saw the way she barely seemed to breathe, and understood that Crowe's visit was not unexpected. She had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, knowing it would come eventually. This was what Garrett had been investigating, what he had died trying to resolve. And now, with Garrett gone, Elowen faced these threats alone. Alistair did what his position and power had trained him to do. He informed Crowe that as executor of Garrett Hartfell's estate, he would need to conduct a thorough review of any claims against the widow. He made clear that Lady Hartfell was under his protection as per her late husband's explicit wishes, and that any attempts to collect alleged debts would need to proceed through proper legal channels with full documentation and verification. He used his title deliberately, letting Crowe understand that pursuing this matter would mean contending with the full weight of the Blackthorn name and resources. Crowe maintained his pleasant expression throughout Alistair's speech, but something cold flickered in his eyes, a warning that this was far from over. He agreed to provide additional documentation and departed with promises to be in touch again soon. The moment the front door closed behind him, Elowen stood abruptly and left the room without a word, practically fleeing despite her attempt to maintain dignity. Alistair found her in the library where they had first met, standing again at that window overlooking the gardens. This time when she turned to face him, the ice had cracked, and what lay beneath was raw terror barely contained. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her breath coming in short gasps that suggested panic was very close to overwhelming her completely. Alistair approached slowly, carefully, as one might approach a wounded animal, and when he was close enough he did something he had not planned. He reached out and took her hand. The touch seemed to anchor her, pulling her back from whatever edge she had been teetering on. She gripped his hand with surprising strength, holding on as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had become unmoored. Gradually, her breathing slowed, the panic receding enough for words to return, and then, finally, she began to tell him the truth. Her father had been a gambler and a speculator who made terrible choices with money that was not his to lose. He had borrowed from people who did not forgive debts, had used Elowen's mother's family property as collateral for loans he never intended to repay. When his schemes collapsed, he had not faced the consequences with courage or contrition. Instead, he had taken the coward's way, ending both his own life and her mother's in a murder-suicide that left Elowen orphaned and alone at 14 years old. The property had been seized, the debts supposedly settled through liquidation of everything her parents had owned. Elowen had been sent to live with distant relatives who made clear she was an unwelcome burden. She had endured years of barely concealed contempt, treated as a charity case whose very existence was a reminder of scandal and shame. She had learned to make herself small and invisible, to require nothing and expect less. Then she had met Garrett at a country gathering, where she had gone as companion to her cousin. He had been kind to her when kindness was not expected or required. He had seen past the shame she carried to the person she actually was. When he asked her to marry him, she had been honest about her past, about the debts and the scandal and the possibility that her father's creditors might someday come calling. Garrett had insisted none of that mattered, that they would face whatever came together. That love was more important than money or social standing. For 5 years they had been happy at Ravenshade. Elowen had begun to believe that perhaps her past could stay buried, that she had escaped the consequences of her father's sins. Then Garrett had started receiving letters, inquiries from lawyers representing creditors who had apparently never actually been paid, despite the liquidation of her parents' estate. He had travelled to London to investigate, determined to resolve the matter once and for all, and now he was dead, and the wolves were circling with renewed hunger. She believed Garrett's death was no accident. She believed someone had killed him to prevent whatever he had been about to uncover, and she believed that now, with her protector gone, she would lose everything, not just Ravenshade and financial security, but perhaps her freedom or even her life if these debts were enforced through the kind of terrible means her father's creditors were rumoured to employ. Alistair listened to all of this with growing anger on her behalf. The injustice of it burned in his chest. That a child should be held responsible for her father's crimes, that a woman who had done nothing wrong should face ruin because of debts incurred before she was even born. He told her in no uncertain terms that he would not allow this to happen, that his resources and position would be used to fight these claims and protect her from creditors who had no legitimate grievance against her personally. But even as he made these promises, he saw the doubt in her eyes. She had been let down before, had learned not to trust assurances from people who might leave or abandon her when circumstances became difficult. Garrett had promised to protect her and had died trying. Why should she believe Alistair would fare any better? He had no answer to that doubt, except continued presence and demonstrated commitment. So he stayed at Ravenshade, conducting investigations into Crow's claims, while also managing the day-to-day needs of the estate. He wrote to his own lawyers in London, instructing them to research the debts and find weaknesses in the documentation. He made inquiries through contacts in government and banking circles, trying to understand who Crow actually represented and what leverage might exist to counter their threats. In the midst of all this activity, something unexpected began to develop between Alistair and Elowen. It started with shared meals, where conversation gradually moved beyond business matters to more personal topics. Elowen began to relax fractionally in his presence, her defensive walls lowering enough for glimpses of the woman Garrett had fallen in love with to emerge. She was intelligent and well-read, capable of debating literature and philosophy, with insights that challenged Alistair's own assumptions. She had a dry wit that appeared unexpectedly, making him laugh in moments when the weight of their circumstances felt overwhelming. For his part, Alistair found himself drawn to her in ways he had not anticipated and knew he should not allow. She was his dead friend's widow, a woman he had sworn to protect rather than pursue. But the heart, he was discovering, had little respect for propriety or proper timing. He noticed small things about her, the way she absently tucked hair behind her ear when concentrating, the rare smile that transformed her entire face, the grace with which she moved through rooms as though dancing to music only she could hear. He found himself manufacturing excuses to spend time in her presence, volunteering to accompany her on walks through the gardens or to help her sort through Garrett's belongings. These moments together felt both innocent and charged with something neither acknowledged, but both sensed growing between them. There were times when their hands would brush reaching for the same book, or when their eyes would meet across the dinner table, and the air would feel electric with possibility. Alistair tried to maintain appropriate distance, reminded himself constantly of his duty to Garrett's memory. But duty was a cold companion in the long evenings when he and Elowen sat together in the library, reading or talking while the fire burned low. Those were the moments when he most acutely felt the pull toward her, the desire not just for physical closeness, but for the kind of emotional intimacy that terrified him precisely because it felt so inevitable. Elowen, for her part, seemed equally conflicted. There were times when she would look at him with something like longing, then immediately retreat behind her defensive walls as though punishing herself for the transgression of feeling anything beyond grief. She spoke of Garrett often in those early weeks, describing their life together in ways that emphasized her loyalty and devotion. Alistair understood these recitations were partly for her own benefit, reminders of why she could not, should not, allow herself to develop feelings for anyone else, especially not her dead husband's best friend. The investigation into Crow's claims yielded disturbing results. Alistair's lawyers confirmed that debts had indeed been incurred by Elowen's father, but the liquidation that supposedly settled them had been irregular at best. Property had been sold for fractions of its value, proceeds had disappeared into accounts that could not be traced, and the creditors who now claimed money owed were not the same entities who had made the original loans. Someone had bought the debts years after the fact, acquiring rights to collect on obligations that should have been resolved long ago. More troubling was what Alistair learned about Nathaniel Crow himself. The man was known in London legal circles as someone who handled matters for powerful people who preferred to remain behind the scenes. He had connections to criminal enterprises disguised as legitimate businesses and a reputation for achieving results through methods that skirted the boundaries of legality. The fact that Crow was involved suggested these debt collection efforts were about more than simple money. There was some other agenda at work, though Alistair could not yet identify what it might be. He also learned, through careful inquiries, that Garrett had been asking questions in London about the same matters. He had met with Crow at least twice in the months before his death, meetings that had apparently been contentious based on reports from those who witnessed them. Garrett had also hired a private investigator to research the liquidation of the Hartfell estate, but that investigator had disappeared shortly before Garrett's own death, his offices ransacked, and all his records stolen. When Alistair shared these findings with Elowen, he watched her face carefully. She took the information with outward calm, but he saw the fear underneath, the understanding that they were dealing with people who had already committed violence and would not hesitate to do so again. She asked what he intended to do, and he told her the truth. He would fight these claims through every legal means available, but he would also prepare for the possibility that legal means might not be sufficient. He sent word to his estate in the north, requesting that several of his most trusted men come to Ravenshade. These were men who had served his family for generations, who understood loyalty and discretion, and who were capable of providing security beyond what Mrs. Brennan and the handful of groundskeepers could offer. When they arrived, Alistair positioned them around the property, instructing them to watch for anything unusual and to ensure that Elowen was never unguarded. These precautions proved prescient when, one evening shortly after the men arrived, they caught an intruder attempting to enter the house through a window in the unused west wing. The man was carrying tools that suggested his intent was theft or sabotage rather than simple trespassing. Under questioning, he refused to identify who had sent him, but his clothing and equipment suggested professional rather than opportunistic crime. Alistair had him turned over to the local magistrate, though he doubted the man would reveal anything useful, even under official interrogation. The attempted intrusion shook Elowen badly. For the first time since Alistair had arrived, she abandoned her pretense of strength and admitted she was terrified. She did not want to stay at Ravenshade any longer, did not feel safe in a place where her husband had died and strangers now broke into her home. But she had nowhere else to go, no family who would take her in, no resources to establish herself elsewhere if she lost the estate to Crow's claims. Alistair made a decision then that he knew would complicate everything but felt unavoidable given the circumstances. He invited her to return with him to Blackthorn Manor, to stay there under his protection until the legal matters could be resolved. He made the offer as formally as possible, emphasizing that it was about safety rather than anything else, that she would have her own apartments and complete privacy, that his staff would ensure propriety was maintained at all times. Elowin's response was not what he expected. Instead of accepting or declining, she laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. She pointed out what she assumed Alistair must already know, that accepting such an invitation would destroy what remained of her reputation. Society would assume she was his mistress regardless of actual circumstances, would condemn her for dishonoring her husband's memory by taking up with his friend mere months after being widowed. She would trade the threat of financial ruin for the certainty of social ruin, becoming an outcast who could never show her face in respectable company again. Alistair acknowledged the truth of her concerns, but argued that survival mattered more than reputation, that being alive and disgraced was preferable to being dead with one's honor intact. He pointed out that she had no good options available, only choices between different types of risk, and he made clear that his invitation was genuine and would stand regardless of her decision, that he would respect whatever choice she made, even if he disagreed with it. They argued about this late into the night, voices rising and falling as they debated duty versus pragmatism, honor versus necessity. At some point during that argument, Alistair realized they were no longer simply discussing living arrangements, but were instead circling around the larger question neither had been willing to address directly: the growing attachment between them that had nothing to do with Garrett's wishes or executor responsibilities, and everything to do with genuine feeling that had developed, despite every reason it should not have. The realization seemed to strike them both simultaneously. The argument faltered mid-sentence, words trailing off into silence as they looked at each other across the space of the library that had become their usual meeting place. In that moment, Alistair saw his own confused emotions reflected in Elowin's eyes, desire mixed with guilt, longing tempered by loyalty to someone who was gone but not forgotten. He crossed the room before conscious thought could stop him, moving toward her with intent that was probably written clearly on his face. She did not retreat, did not raise her hands to ward him off, but simply stood watching his approach with an expression that mixed resignation and relief. When he was close enough to touch her, he stopped, giving her the choice to close the final distance between them or step away. She chose to step forward. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, as though both were afraid that too much passion would shatter the fragile thing growing between them. But gentleness gave way quickly to hunger, to need that had been building for weeks beneath polite conversation and careful distance. Alistair pulled her close, feeling her tremble against him, tasting salt from tears he had not realized she was crying. The kiss deepened, became desperate, until finally Elowin broke away with a gasp that sounded like both pleasure and pain. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her hands fisted in his shirt, and whispered an apology that broke his heart. She said she could not do this, could not betray Garrett's memory by developing feelings for his closest friend. She insisted that what she felt was just confusion born of grief and fear, that Alistair was being kind, and she was mistaking kindness for something more significant. She begged him to forget what had just happened, to return to their previous roles of protector, and protected without allowing this lapse to change anything fundamental between them. Alistair wanted to argue, to insist that what existed between them was real and valuable, regardless of timing or circumstances, but he saw the genuine anguish in her face and understood that pushing now would only drive her away entirely. So he agreed to her request, stepping back and letting her flee to her room with some fragment of dignity and tact. He stood alone in the library afterward, touching his lips where the ghost of their kiss still lingered, and wondered how he was supposed to protect someone he was falling in love with while pretending he felt nothing beyond duty-bound responsibility. The following days were awkward and painful. Elowin avoided him when possible, taking meals in her room and claiming business that kept her occupied during hours they would normally have spent together. When they did encounter each other, she maintained careful distance, her manner polite but cool, as though the kiss had never happened, and they were merely business associates who happened to occupy the same house. Alistair threw himself into the investigation, using work as an excuse to avoid confronting his own complicated emotions. His lawyers uncovered more irregularities in the debt documentation, enough to potentially challenge Crow's claims in court. But legal battles took time and money, resources Elowen did not possess even with Alistair's support. More concerning were reports from his contacts in London that Crow had been asking questions about Alistair himself, as though researching weaknesses that could be exploited. Then came the night that changed everything. Alistair woke to sounds of struggle coming from elsewhere in the house. He grabbed the pistol he had taken to keeping loaded on his nightstand and ran toward the noise, arriving at Elowen's room to find her door broken open and two men attempting to drag her from her bed. His presence and the sight of the weapon made them release her and flee, but not before one landed a blow that sent Alistair crashing into furniture, delaying his pursuit long enough for them to escape into the darkness. Elowen was hysterical, trembling so violently she could barely stand. Alistair wrapped her in a blanket and held her while she sobbed out terror and rage, asking why they would not leave her alone, what more they could possibly want from her. His own fear and anger mixed with overwhelming protective instinct, and he made promises in that moment that he fully intended to keep, that he would find whoever was behind these attacks, that he would make them pay for frightening her, that he would ensure she never felt unsafe again. Once she had calmed somewhat, Alistair insisted she could not stay in that room, could not remain at Ravenshade at all, given that intruders now knew the house well enough to break in repeatedly. She did not argue this time, too frightened to maintain her earlier resistance. So in the darkest hours before dawn, they fled together, taking only what could be quickly gathered and leaving trusted servants to secure the house until their return. The journey to Blackthorn Manor took most of the day, Alistair pushing his horses as fast as safety allowed, while constantly watching for signs of pursuit. Elowen said little during the trip, sitting beside him wrapped in travelling blankets, staring at landscape that passed in a blur. Once she reached over and took his hand, holding it quietly for several miles without speaking. The gesture said everything words could not, that she trusted him, that her earlier resistance had been about fear rather than lack of feeling, that perhaps they could find their way towards something honest, despite the complications of circumstance and propriety. Blackthorn Manor rose against the northern sky like something from a fairy tale, all towers and battlements built to impress and intimidate. Elowen stared at it with wide eyes, seeming to understand for the first time the full weight of the position and power Alistair commanded. He watched her reaction carefully, wondering if the reality of his wealth and status would create new distance between them, if she would retreat again behind walls of perceived unworthiness or inappropriate aspiration. But when she turned to look at him, what he saw in her face was not intimidation or social calculation. Instead, there was simple gratitude, a recognition that he had used everything he possessed to protect her when she had no one else to turn to. She squeezed his hand once more before releasing it, and together they entered his ancestral home to begin whatever came next. The weeks that followed established new patterns between them. Elowen was given apartments in the family wing rather than the guest quarters, a subtle statement of her status in the household. Alistair's staff treated her with respect due to someone under the Duke's personal protection, asking no questions about her presence or her relationship to their employer. They established routines of shared meals and evening hours in the library, conversations that ranged from business matters to personal histories they had never discussed before. Alistair learned more about Elowen's childhood in those conversations, the years of isolation and shame she had endured after her parents' deaths. She described the relatives who had taken her in with such obvious reluctance, making her earn her keep through endless chores while reminding her constantly of the scandal she represented. She spoke of the loneliness of being surrounded by people who viewed her as a burden rather than a person deserving of love or consideration. When she met Garrett, she had been so starved for kindness that his simple decency had seemed like a miracle. She had married him gratefully, determined to be the perfect wife in exchange for the security and acceptance he offered. Their marriage had been happy, she insisted, though Alistair detected nuances in her description that suggested companionship and mutual respect rather than passionate romance. Garrett had loved her, certainly, but had perhaps been more protector than partner, more guardian than equal. Alistair shared his own history in return, the burden of inheriting his title young when his father died unexpectedly, the loneliness of a position that set him apart from peers who might otherwise have been friends, the constant pressure of responsibilities that left little room for personal desires or authentic connection. He spoke of expectations and duties, of choices made for family honor rather than individual happiness, of a life that looked privileged from the outside but often felt like a beautifully decorated prison. These conversations created intimacy of a type Alistair had never experienced before. With Elowen, he did not have to maintain the careful facade of ducal perfection. He could admit doubts and fears, could be human rather than the role his birth had assigned him. And he sensed she felt similarly freed, able to speak honestly about her past and present, without fear of judgment or rejection. The attraction between them, so carefully suppressed after their kiss at Ravenshade, reasserted itself gradually through these conversations. There were moments of accidental touching, hands brushing when passing books, shoulders bumping when walking through narrow passages, the brush of fingers when reaching for the same door handle. Each contact felt charged, electric, reminding them both of what they were trying not to acknowledge. Then came the evening when news arrived from London. Alistair's lawyers had uncovered the truth behind Crow's debt collection efforts. The debts were real, but they had been deliberately kept alive for years through a scheme that involved false accounting and bribery of court officials. The liquidation of Elowen's parents' estate had been manipulated to ensure full payment was never actually made, preserving the debts as tools that could be used to control or extort the heir at some future point. More shocking was the revelation of who had orchestrated this scheme. The name meant nothing to Alistair initially, just another wealthy merchant with interests in shipping and mining. But when he researched further, he discovered connections that made his blood run cold. The man had been a business associate of Elowen's father, had been owed money when the gambling debts came due, and had apparently decided that revenge and long-term control were more valuable than immediate repayment. This man had spent years building power and influence, waiting for the perfect moment to use the debts against Elowen. When she married Garrett and gained the protection of a respectable family, he had bided his time. When Garrett started investigating and getting too close to the truth, he had arranged an accident that was no accident at all. And now, with Garrett dead and Elowen vulnerable, he was moving to collect not just money, but something darker: submission, control, perhaps even Elowen herself as some twisted form of compensation for his long-ago business losses. Alistair shared this information with Elowen carefully, watching her process each revelation with a mix of horror and bitter vindication. She had suspected much of this, had known in her bones that Garrett's death was murder, despite official rulings of accident. Now she had proof, or at least evidence strong enough to build a case if they could find witnesses willing to testify. But evidence and legal action took time, and the enemy was not waiting patiently. 2 days after receiving the lawyer's report, Alistair received a message delivered by a stranger who departed before he could be questioned. The message was from Crow, written in the same politely threatening tone he had used at Ravenshade. It acknowledged that Alistair had been clever in his investigations, commended him for protecting Lady Hartfell so devotedly, then made clear that neither cleverness nor devotion would ultimately matter. The message explained that certain debts were enforceable, regardless of irregularities in documentation, that Lady Hartfell would be wise to settle her obligations before matters became even more unpleasant, and that the Duke of Blackthorn should consider carefully whether one woman's welfare was worth risking his own position and reputation. There were hints at scandals that could be manufactured, suggestions that Alistair's protection of Elowen could be portrayed as something tawdry rather than noble, threats that power could be turned against power if he insisted on continuing this fight. Alistair read the message twice, fury building with each word. He showed it to Elowen and watched her face crumple with despair. She said what he knew she would say, that he had already done more than anyone could expect, that she could not allow him to risk everything for her sake, that she should simply surrender to Crow's demands and spare Alistair further involvement. She spoke of leaving Blackthorn Manor, disappearing somewhere Crow could not find her, living whatever life remained to her in isolation rather than bringing destruction to those who had tried to help her. Alistair responded by pulling her into his arms and kissing her with an intensity that left no room for doubt about his feelings or his intentions. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he told her in terms that allowed no argument that he was not giving up, not walking away, not abandoning her to face these monsters alone. He said that some things mattered more than reputation or position, that protecting her had become the most important thing in his life, and that if loving her made him a scandal, then he would be scandalous with no regrets whatsoever. Elowen stared at him with tears streaming down her face, and for a long moment he thought she would argue or pull away. Instead, she kissed him again, fierce and desperate, holding him as though he might disappear if she loosened her grip. When they finally separated enough to speak, she admitted what he had already known, that she loved him too, had been fighting it for weeks because it felt like betrayal, but could no longer deny what her heart insisted was true. They talked through the night, making plans while acknowledging that their growing relationship complicated everything further. Alistair was adamant that they would face whatever came together, that he would use every resource at his disposal to destroy the men threatening her and bring them to justice for Garrett's murder. Elowen was equally clear that she would not allow him to sacrifice himself for her sake, that if it came to choosing between his safety and her own, she would choose his without hesitation. Their arguments on this point were heated, but never truly adversarial. Both understood they were negotiating from positions of love rather than opposition. Eventually, they reached compromises that satisfied neither completely, but both could accept. They would continue fighting through legal channels, while also building a case for criminal prosecution. They would be cautious, but not paralyzed by fear. And they would face the future honestly, acknowledging their feelings while respecting Garrett's memory, and the complicated grief that came with loving someone new while still mourning someone lost. The legal battle that followed consumed months. Alistair's lawyers filed challenges to Crow's claims, presenting evidence of fraud and manipulation that should have invalidated the debts entirely. But the men behind Crow had resources and connections of their own, judges who could be influenced, officials who could be bribed. Each victory in court seemed to be followed by some new setback or delay, until Alistair understood that they were dealing with people who had corrupted the system itself to serve their purposes. Meanwhile, the threats continued in various forms. Rumours began circulating in London society about the Duke of Blackthorn and his mysterious houseguest, suggestions that he had taken up with his dead friend's widow in ways that dishonoured everyone involved. Anonymous letters arrived at Blackthorn Manor with accusations and insults that seemed designed to drive a wedge between Alistair and Elowen. There were incidents that might have been accidents but felt like warnings. A fire in one of the barns that killed several horses, a servant who fell from a ladder and broke his leg, deliveries that contained spoiled food or damaged goods. Alistair increased security around the estate while accelerating his investigation into the men behind Crow. He hired his own investigators to gather information, reaching out to contacts in government and law enforcement who might be willing to act on evidence of corruption. It was slow, frustrating work that required patience he barely possessed, while Elowen remained under threat. Through it all, his relationship with Elowen deepened into something neither had anticipated. They became genuine partners, working together on strategies and supporting each other through setbacks. She proved to have a sharp mind for tactics, suggesting approaches his lawyers had not considered and identifying weaknesses in their enemies' positions. He discovered strengths in himself he had not known he possessed, a capacity for determination and protective fierceness that went beyond anything his position had required before. They were careful about physical intimacy, both conscious that scandal could undermine their legal position. But there were stolen moments, kisses in quiet corridors, embraces when fear or frustration became overwhelming, nights when one would seek comfort in the other's room and they would simply hold each other until dawn. These moments felt more precious for being forbidden, more meaningful for being chosen, in defiance of everything that said they should wait or deny what they felt. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Garrett's former servants, a man who had left Ravenshade shortly before Garrett's death, came forward with information he had been too frightened to share previously. He had witnessed a meeting between Garrett and two men the morning of his death, had heard arguments about documents and threats about what would happen if Garrett continued his investigation. He could identify the men, could testify about what he had heard, and most importantly, he had kept a letter Garrett had given him with instructions to deliver to authorities if anything happened. The letter Garrett had written was damning. It laid out everything he had discovered: the fraud, the manipulation, the names of men involved in keeping Elowen's debts alive. It included evidence he had gathered, documents showing bribes and falsified records, even suggestions about where more evidence might be found. Most critically, it named the man at the center of everything: the former business associate of Elowen's father, who had built his revenge into a decades-long scheme of control and intimidation. With this evidence and the servant's testimony, Alistair finally had weapons sufficient to fight back effectively. He took everything to government officials he trusted, making clear that he would not be silenced or intimidated, that he had resources to continue pressing the matter through every channel available. He also made clear that any attempt to harm Elowen or himself would result in all the evidence being released publicly, ensuring that even if they could not get justice through official channels, the court of public opinion would destroy those responsible. The response was swift and comprehensive. Arrests were made, including Nathaniel Crowe, who turned witness against his employers in exchange for leniency. Properties were seized, businesses investigated, corruption exposed in ways that sent shockwaves through both legal and financial circles. The man behind it all, Elowen's father's old associate, fought back desperately, using every connection and resource at his disposal. But Alistair had anticipated this resistance and prepared accordingly, ensuring that each defensive move was met with overwhelming counter-pressure. The final resolution came not in a courtroom, but in a private meeting arranged through intermediaries. Alistair sat across from the man who had orchestrated decades of misery, looking at someone who appeared ordinary despite the extraordinary evil he had committed. They negotiated like generals discussing terms of surrender. The man would sign documents releasing all claims against Elowen, would provide additional evidence against his co-conspirators, and would retire from business and public life entirely. In exchange, Alistair would not pursue charges that could result in execution, would allow the man to keep enough resources for comfortable exile, and would not publish evidence of his involvement in Garrett's murder. It felt like compromise with evil, and Alistair hated every moment of it. But Elowen had been consulted throughout, and she had made clear that destroying this man completely mattered less to her than ending the threat he represented and honoring Garrett's memory by ensuring some form of justice was achieved. So Alistair accepted terms that left a bitter taste in his mouth, but accomplished the essential goal. Elowen was free, the debts eliminated, the danger ended. The relief that followed was profound but complicated. They had won, survived, emerged from threat with lives and resources intact. But victory brought its own challenges, particularly regarding what came next for them personally. They had fallen in love while fighting for survival, had built intimacy in the midst of crisis. Now, facing peace and possibility, they had to decide what kind of future they actually wanted, rather than simply reacting to circumstances. Alistair knew what he wanted: to marry Elowen, to build a life with her that honored both her strengths and his own needs, to create the kind of partnership he had glimpsed during their time together. But he also knew that asking her to marry him so soon after Garrett's death, after months of scandal and speculation about their relationship, would expose her to exactly the kind of social condemnation she had feared. Society would assume she had been his mistress throughout, would treat her marriage to him as confirmation of impropriety rather than genuine feeling. They discussed this at length during long evenings in the library that had become their sanctuary. Elowen was willing to endure scandal if it meant building a life with Alistair, but he worried about what long-term social isolation would cost her. He suggested waiting, allowing time to pass until her widowhood was considered appropriately honored, until their eventual marriage could be seen as respectable rather than suspicious. Elowen surprised him by arguing against delay. She pointed out that they had already faced death together, had already weathered threats that would have destroyed lesser bonds. She insisted that worrying about society's opinion was giving power to people whose judgment mattered far less than their own happiness. And she made clear that she had loved Garrett truly, but loved Alistair differently, that one love did not diminish the other, and that Garrett himself would have wanted her to find joy rather than remaining frozen in grief forever. Her arguments convinced him, partly through logic but mostly through the force of her conviction. They decided to marry quietly, with only close friends and necessary witnesses present, making no great announcement or celebration that might feel like disrespect to Garrett's memory. Later, when enough time had passed, they would host proper celebrations and face society together, united in a way that would make speculation irrelevant. The ceremony took place at Blackthorn Manor on a spring morning when the gardens were finally beginning to recover from winter's long grip. Ellawen wore a simple dress in cream rather than white, carrying wildflowers she had picked herself that morning, in a gesture that reminded Alistair of her first wedding to Garrett. He wore no formal regalia, just a well-tailored suit, understanding that this moment was about commitment rather than display. As they exchanged vows, Alistair thought about Garrett and felt certain that his friend would have approved. Not perhaps of the specific circumstances. Garrett would have preferred to be alive, to have grown old with Ellawen in the happiness they had built at Ravenshade. But given the reality of his death and the threats that had followed, Garrett would have wanted exactly what Alistair was providing: protection, genuine love, partnership that honored Ellawen's strength rather than diminishing it. Their life together after the wedding settled into patterns that felt both extraordinary and comfortingly ordinary. They divided time between Blackthorn Manor and Ravenshade, which Ellawen reclaimed as a place of peace rather than tragedy. Alistair helped her transform it, making changes that honored Garrett's memory while also creating space for new memories to form. They traveled occasionally, taking trips to places Ellawen had never seen, building a collection of shared experiences that belonged to them alone. Society eventually accepted their marriage, though perhaps never entirely without speculation. There were always those who whispered about timing and propriety, who suggested things that were insulting even if occasionally accurate. But Alistair and Ellawen faced these judgments together, presenting a united front that eventually wore down even the most determined gossips. Their genuine affection for each other was too obvious to deny, their partnership too strong to be dismissed as mere scandal. Years later, when Alistair looked back on that period of his life, he understood that loving Ellawen had required choosing between competing loyalties, honoring his promise to protect Garrett's widow versus following his own heart toward a woman he had come to love. In the end, he had discovered that these loyalties were not actually contradictory. Protecting Ellawen had meant giving her everything she needed, including love that was offered freely rather than from duty alone. Garrett's memory remained present in their lives, not as a ghost haunting their happiness, but as a foundation supporting it. They spoke of him often, keeping his humor and kindness alive through stories shared with friends, and eventually with children who bore names chosen partly to honor him. The wound of his loss never fully healed, but it became integrated into who they were together rather than something that separated them from joy. On anniversaries of Garrett's death, they would visit his grave together, standing in quiet remembrance of a man who had loved them both and had trusted them to honor that love by living fully rather than remaining trapped in grief. Alistair would tell his old friend about their life, about victories and challenges, about everything Garrett had missed. And somehow, in the silence that followed those one-sided conversations, he always felt a presence that suggested approval, not perhaps of every detail, but of the fundamental truth that love endures, transforms, and ultimately honors those who came before by creating meaning from their loss. Their story became one whispered about in certain circles, romanticized and distorted through repetition until it bore only passing resemblance to the complicated reality they had lived. But Alistair and Ellawen did not mind the distortions, understanding that truth mattered less than the lesson embedded in even the most fictionalized versions. That loyalty and love need not be enemies, that honoring the past does not require sacrificing the future, and that sometimes the most profound promises are fulfilled not through rigid adherence to original intentions, but through adaptation to circumstances that require wisdom rather than mere obedience. They grew old together, watching the world change around them while maintaining the partnership they had forged in crisis. Their love remained strong, not because it was perfect or uncomplicated, but because it had been tested by fire and emerged transformed into something more durable than either could have created alone. And when death finally came for them in its time, they faced it together with the same courage that had carried them through every previous challenge, secure in the knowledge that they had honored both love and loyalty by refusing to choose between them when circumstances demanded both. Epilogue. The portrait hung in the main gallery at Blackthorn Manor, commissioned during the 5th year of their marriage, when both Alistair and Elowen had finally shed the shadows that had clung to them during those early, tumultuous months. The artist had captured them standing together in the gardens at Ravenshade, the estate that had witnessed both tragedy and transformation serving as the backdrop to their partnership. Alistair stood with one hand resting gently on Elowen's shoulder, his expression radiating a contentment that transformed his usually serious features into something approaching serenity. Elowen, positioned slightly in front of him, looked directly at the viewer with those storm-grey eyes that had once held only fear, but now reflected hard-won peace and quiet confidence. What the portrait could not capture were the smaller details that defined their daily existence. The way Elowen still reached for Alistair's hand during thunderstorms, a remnant of nights when danger felt imminent and his presence was the only anchor keeping her from drowning in panic. Or how Alistair would sometimes pause in doorways just to watch her work in her study, marveling at how this woman, who had once seemed so fragile, had revealed herself to be forged from steel wrapped in silk. The portrait showed dignity and partnership, which was accurate enough, but it missed the laughter that filled their private moments, the arguments that flared and subsided with equal intensity, the comfortable silences that spoke of intimacy deeper than words could express. Their children, 3 in total, though the youngest would not arrive until after the portrait was completed, grew up hearing stories about their Uncle Garrett, the man whose love for their mother had been pure enough to ensure her survival even after his own death. The children knew their father's best friend only through anecdotes and the small memorial garden their mother tended meticulously at Ravenshade, but they understood instinctively that Garrett's memory was something sacred in their household, never to be dismissed or diminished. The eldest, a daughter with her mother's grey eyes and her father's stubborn determination, bore Garrett's surname as her middle name, a gesture that had moved even society's harshest critics to acknowledge the genuine respect this family maintained for the past while building their future. Blackthorn Manor and Ravenshade both flourished under Alistair and Elowen's joint stewardship. They implemented reforms that improved conditions for tenants, established schools on their properties, that educated children regardless of social station, and created a model of estate management that balanced profit with genuine care for the people whose labour generated that wealth. Elowen's influence softened Alistair's sometimes rigid adherence to tradition, while his political acumen and social standing gave weight to her more progressive ideas. Together, they became known not just for their controversial beginning, but for the concrete good they accomplished through their partnership. The legal victory over Crowe and his employers had wider ramifications than either had anticipated. The corruption exposed during their battle led to reforms in debt collection practices and greater scrutiny of estate liquidations. Alistair had leveraged his position to ensure these changes became permanent, rather than temporary responses to scandal, understanding that the best way to honor what Elowen had endured was to prevent others from suffering similar exploitation. She had supported these efforts with testimony before parliamentary committees, facing down men who would have preferred her silence, speaking truth to power with a courage that had made Alistair fall in love with her all over again. As years passed and they aged together, their love deepened in ways neither had expected. The passion of their early relationship, born from crisis and forbidden attraction, matured into something more substantial, a foundation that supported not just romance, but genuine friendship. They became each other's favorite conversationalist, preferred companion, trusted advisor. On quiet evenings when responsibilities had been met and children had been settled for the night, they would sit together in their library, reading or simply existing in comfortable proximity, and both would marvel at how life had brought them to this unexpected peace. There were still difficult moments, of course. Grief was not something that could be resolved permanently, only integrated and managed. On certain anniversaries or when reminded suddenly of Garrett by some random trigger, a laugh that sounded like his, a turn of phrase he had favoured. Eowyn would retreat into herself, needing space to honour emotions that belonged to a different chapter of her life. Alistair had learned not to take these withdrawals personally, understanding that loving him fully did not mean forgetting Garrett entirely. He gave her room when she needed it,